to share my thesis work with you all this afternoon. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Dana Wolf, for her guidance throughout this nearly year-long process, as well as acknowledge the funding from the Political Science and Feminist General Studies departments, and the Keller Venture Grant, and the Sheffer Fund for Roman Catholic Studies, which helped enable me to conduct my research in Ireland. So my thesis was inspired by two events. The first occurred in the spring of 2015 when, by national referendum, the notoriously Catholic country of Ireland legalized same-sex marriage by a ratio of about 2-1. This made waves in the international community largely because of its distancing from the Catholic Church's interpretation of marriage. Secondly, in May 2018, Ireland repealed their constitutional ban on abortion, again by national referendum, with 66% of the vote. The Eighth Amendment of their constitution, quoted here, was implemented by national referendum in 1983 by a similarly overwhelming margin. This 3-decade turnaround, along with the trend amongst electorates in open-ended social issue referendums to vote conservatively, made it an interesting puzzle in and of itself. But my interest was further piqued by the fact that both of these events were treated by Irish and international news sources as unprecedented testimonies of unrest between the traditional bedfellows of the Catholic Church and the Republic of Ireland. This sentiment is perhaps best exemplified by the New York Times headline the day after the abortion ban was repealed. It read, "Where did Ireland go?" As though this event sprouted from an alien, ahistorical, and discreet public, which had never before demonstrated signs of resistance to the Church. Hysterical responses to this rift drew upon an agreed-upon scholastic and popular discourse regarding the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Irish state. These discourses rest on the presumption that church-sanctioned activities are the locus of expressions of Catholic faith, and that resistances to church mandate are necessarily anti-Catholic. This model fails to account for the non-canonical ways in which the Catholic faith has informed and shaped Irish identity and politics, both historically and contemporarily, as well as erases instances of resistance from within participation with the Church. So my thesis argues the following. Fanaticism about these most recent referenda ignore the fact that resistance and activism against the Church is nothing new. In fact, a spirit of resistance has existed since the moment of Christianity's introduction to the island. Although in opposition to clerical mandate and church doctrine, these resistances should not necessarily be characterized as anti-Catholic, for Catholic social teaching pervades the very essence of many of these rebellions. Further, conflating Catholic robustness with mass attendance and clerical matriculation, which is a common source of evidence in scholastic discourse, ignores the ways in which participation does not necessarily imply obedience with the Church. So I researched and wrote this project from January to March of this year in Ireland, mainly residing in Dublin, but also spending time in Galway, Limerick, Cork, Sligo, and Wicklow. I worked largely out of Trinity College's library in Dublin, and I conducted interviews with professors in political science and religious studies, with a nun at a Dublin cathedral, and with activists involved in assorted movements across the country. My interviews greatly informed my reading on Irish history, and my travels in Ireland helped immeasurably in my understanding of this relationship. The resulting thesis explores Irish history via 5 case studies, ranging in time from St. Patrick's arrival to the island to an uprising in 1946, and reinterprets them using my arguments. I then return to the cases of the recent referenda with this new context. For the sake of this presentation, I've just chosen 2 of my 5 case studies, which illustrate a different side of my 2-part argument. From 1845 to 1848, 3 successive Irish potato harvests failed, likely due to a virus introduced from North America. The famine which ensued reduced the Irish population from 8 million to just about 4, with about 2 million people emigrating and another 1.5 to 2 perishing. At this time, Ireland was under British rule, and the relief provided by the British state did next to nothing to quell the devastation from this famine. Instead, the Catholic Church found itself equipped to meet the needs of this decimated population, and in this period it became the source of healthcare and education and centers of community, as well as just basic relief from starvation. Emmett Larkin's 1972 article coined the term devotional revolution to characterize the period immediately following the Great Famine. He argues that this time was one of unprecedented devotion to the Catholic Church and allegiance to the Catholic faith. He cites the radical spikes in mass attendance and Irish recruits to the priesthood as to demonstrate his point. This time for Larkin was one in which, quote, the church managed to build itself into the very vitals of the nation by becoming almost one with its identity, end quote. His contributions to scholastic understanding of this time are colossal. In academic circles, the devotional revolution is a bit of a watchword. It's referred to with an air of settled uponness, of foundational fact of the matter. However, anecdotal and qualitative evidence from the time points to the existence of a less than devotional period. Cara DeLay's 2004 article picks apart Larkin's devotional revolution with evidence from the journals and letters exchanged between clergy of this time. She finds the clergy reported on lax mass and confession attendance, their parishioners' failure to receive communion, and the laity's poor knowledge of the catechism during the bishop's visitation of parishes. Some priests, in addition, continued to combat drunkenness, defamation, violence, carnivalesque amusements, which, in their view, compounded their people's lack of commitment to religious duties. Larkin himself admits, in a brief aside in the middle of his article, that these new priests weren't necessarily going the way of saints either. The principal vices amongst the clergy were drunkenness, women, and avarice. I bring this evidence to light to argue that simple statistics regarding mass attendance and priesthood recruitment do not linearly correspond with piety and devoutness. Scholarship on this topic often takes its relationship for granted, and in doing so erases a history of disquiet and negotiation from within the church's walls. On the flip side, the decline in mass attendance and priest recruitment today do not necessarily indicate waning Catholicism in Ireland. Or, as I will explain next, Catholicism's expression need not be interpreted so narrowly. In 1946, a period in which Ireland was unindustrialized and rural villages were largely considered to be under the thumb of the local priest, 25-year-old Peggy McCarthy became pregnant out of wedlock. She was from the small Irish town of Listowel, their church is pictured there, one of 10 siblings, and was living at home at the time. Though her pregnancy was not necessarily celebrated, it was tolerated by her family, and when she went into labor on February 10th, she was attended in her home by her mother and a midwife. However, serious complications soon arose, and the family called their close friend John to take Peggy in his hackney to the local hospital, which was just a mile away. Peggy was turned away at the door. The nuns who ran the hospital cited Catholic and governmental regulations, which dictated that hospitals turn away all unwed mothers seeking medical attention. Peggy was turned away at 2 further township hospitals before arriving finally at the county hospital in Killarney, which was the only one in the area not controlled by the church and derisively labeled a more suitable place for her equals. Either en route to Killarney or shortly after her arrival, Peggy delivered baby girl Breda and then died. Upon his return to Listowel, John, the hackney driver, he delivered Peggy's body to the church gates, where it would traditionally be prepared for mass and burial. However, he returned to find the gates locked by the local priest, Patrick Brennan. Brennan refused to allow an unwed mother buried in the consecrated ground of the church, a refusal tantamount to locking the gates of heaven against Peggy. This denial so enraged John and other townspeople that they stormed the church and broke the gate down, physically. They demanded that Peggy receive a Catholic burial on the church grounds and were so forceful that Brennan conceded and held a burial for Peggy. She is buried there to this day. I raise this event to demonstrate that anti-church movements need not be collapsed with being anti-Catholic. In fact, this rebellion was done for the sake of a deep conviction in the importance of Catholic sacrament. The rebels used Catholic language to describe Peggy. She is a martyr who deserves a Christian burial and an entrance to heaven, despite what the church had to say. My thesis includes 3 other historical instances of rebellion against the church, as well as a co-optation of Catholic teaching for the purposes of resistance. I discussed the ways in which the direction of power has flowed from the grassroots level of the Irish Republic all the way up through the Catholic hierarchy, as opposed to the popularly imagined other way down. I argue that scholars would do well to investigate more fully the evidence upon which they posit that Ireland's social and political history is one of subservience to the church. Further, work on the subject should expand its definition of where Catholicism may be seen beyond the standard of church participation. When understood through this lens, the referenda to legalize same-sex marriage and repeal the eighth are demystified as ahistorical fractures and situated within a long context of activism. They also cease to become sites of anti-Catholic behavior, where Catholic social teaching pervaded both of these campaigns. The 2015 marriage equality campaign was greatly helped in the weeks leading up to the vote by some unsolicited op-eds in the Irish Times by, quote, card-carrying Catholics who came out in support of the referendum. These articles assured readers that voting in favor of legalizing same-sex marriage did not preclude them from identifying as Catholic, though it was an act against the church. Instead, they appealed to Catholic teaching on helping the disadvantaged, to implore readers to vote for the proposed constitutional amendment. Also, coincidentally, although perhaps not coincidentally, both of these women whose legal case sparked the movement have obtained graduate degrees in theology. As for the Repeal the Eighth campaign, I was very honored to get to interview Alvia Smith, a career activist with central roles in both the marriage equality and repeal campaigns. She very explicitly told me about the deep fear the campaign had of being labeled anti-Catholic. Being branded Catholic is still so deeply rooted in a sense of Irish patriotism that even political opponents to the church are wary to step out of the bounds of such an identification. The campaign then was very intentional in towing the line and not asking even non-practicing Catholics to do away with their allegiance. Instead, they reified Catholicism's importance by framing abortion as a private matter which won't bother the public religious sphere with their slogan, "Sometimes a private matter needs public support." My thesis disrupts popular and scholastic narratives which erase centuries of activism, resistance, and nonconformity within the church walls, while failing to acknowledge the Catholic influences and resistances to the church. In doing so, I argue for recognition of those who have been, quote, paddling like mad under the surface within the church context, as well as a reevaluation of what is meant when we say that the Irish Catholic is on the decline. While ignored by mainstream discourse, the Irish have always demonstrated a spirit of resistance regarding the church, and the most effective arguments presented by these rebels are those informed by Catholic social teaching. Just as sitting in the pews doesn't translate exactly to pious conformity with the church, neither does rebellion against it mean that the Irish Catholic is extinct. Rather, it would be more accurate to read this relationship between the two as colored by negotiation, contention, and co-optation. This model goes a long way in quieting the shock and awe which surrounded these recent referenda and situates them in a more accurate context. Thank you very much. Next, I would like to introduce Carly Cribbs, presenting her project, Scientific Racism and Injustice in Colonial Court.